welcome formally to tonight. I'm Glenn Johnson. I'm with Baranduda Landcare, and Baranduda Landcare is a subgroup of the Kiwa Catchments Landcare group. I'm also with DELP, so I'm with the Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. And I was sort of handling this part of it tonight. And I'd like to commence by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the lands on which we're variously meeting tonight, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge and welcome any Aboriginal people that might be with us tonight. I'm on Dwarf country, and I'd like to recognise the Dwarf Nation's people and their ongoing connections to lands and waters in our neck of the woods. So I'm coming from Baranduda tonight. So tonight's about Sloane's froglet, and it's one of those species that we know a little bit about, but the aim of this workshop is to expand our collective horizons, our knowledge and our understanding of this species, and invariably garner more support. And it's through you, through us as community and us as citizen scientists that we'll be able to gain more understanding and knowledge, and therefore help to provide support and help protect this species. And it's one of those species that's got a restricted range. It's got all sorts of things of threats, such as habitat loss, all the way through to weird and wonderful things, less wonderful things like climate change and the perils of droughts. And yet this species has got an amazing capacity to rebound from pretty dire situations. Think of the Millennium Drought. And it's equally important on both private and Crown land. And so our speakers tonight are going to wow you with an unbelievable overview of Sloane's and the whole myriad of frog species that occur not only in our neck of the woods, in a southern New South Wales, northeast Victoria, but in a more global Australian context. And it's with the view of demonstrating the powers of citizen scientists that you and I and all of us participating tonight, and that might be viewing this recording later, can collaborate and improve our collective knowledge. And I think there's a really weird and interesting thing, an analogy with what we're doing tonight in terms of frogs and frog calls. And I'm into birds and I'm into bird calls. And I know I used to do these surveys with a bloke who would go out on field trips and never get out of bed. He'd never get out of his tent because he was that damn good that he could do his dawn chorus inside his tent and have 10 times more of the birds that I would ever get. And there's a little parallel with frogs in this regard. And the irony is that you'll be discovering the apps that Jody in particular will be talking about, and Helen and all of us will be talking about, and it's reliant on calls. And there's a really important thing that often we're in this situation, we're not going to be necessarily seeing, and importantly not touching frogs in many instances or at all. And there's some really important disease prevention protocols that is fantastic for. So it's my privilege to introduce the speakers that are on your screen tonight. And firstly, we're going to be first hearing from Dr. Helen Wardby, and she's a senior threatened species officer with the New South Wales DPIE, which is the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. And she's a champion at Sloane's Champion. She's a mastermind behind Sloane's Champion. Will give us an overview of Sloane's and the Sloane's Champions concept. And I'm really grateful, and I know that we'll have participants from both Cora and Thurgoona Woolshed Landcare groups who have been the champions under this scheme. And so Helen will be overviewing that. We're going to dovetail in with Helen's talk with Karen Retra, and Karen is an interesting commodity because she is rapidly increasing or expanding her repertoire from a sunshine midday recording, photographing daytime pollinators of all things wild pollinators and she's turned into a Sloane sleuth, getting around in the winter depths of night on cold evenings. So, and she's a fantastic people motivator, and it's part of the reason why I've got into Sloane's. We'll then be really wrapped in hearing from Dr. Jody Rowley, who is the she's a curator of amphibians and reptile conservation biology. She's leading the herpetology department at the Australian Museum and the Research Institute there. And she's also with the University of New South Wales. She's an amazing frog biologist, and she's the lead scientist behind the Australian Museum FrogID app, which no doubt many of you are aware about and already using. And she's definitely a champion in that regard. Lastly, but not leastly, we've got another champion in terms of frog biology, and that's Dr. David Hunter. He's also with New South Wales DEPI. He's also a senior threatened species officer, and he's an amazing person, as are all the other speakers that we've got tonight. So I'm just going to finish now by saying that we're going to try to have this as an audience participation, and there's an opportunity to ask questions rather than singing them out or putting your hand up. If you're into Teams, we're going to use the chat line. So there's an opportunity to use the chat line if you've got questions, and if we can't answer them during the session, we'll certainly try to answer afterwards. We'll conclude at the end, and I'll sum up a little bit more with perhaps some where to from here and what we will be offering at the end of the session. So we'll swing into Helen and Karen now. And as I said, do use the mind if you've got some questions. We'll try to answer key ones. Might be time limited though, so we'll see how we go. So thanks importantly to you, the participants, because this is what it's all about. Citizen Scientists needs you, and we're really appreciative of your participation tonight. So we'll swing into and thank Helen, you're away. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Glenn. I'll just share my screen. Right, can everyone see that screen okay? I'm looking at you, Glenn.
I've just got a total blank screen. I'm only joking. It's perfect.
That's just mean, Glenn. Look, yes, thank you, Glenn, for that wonderful welcome. I am Helen Wardby, and I work with the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment, and particularly within the Ecosystems and Threatened Species team within our New South Wales Government Saving Our Species program. And I'm meeting with you today from Wiradjuri land, and Wiradjuri people are also the traditional owners of the land upon which all this work we're talking about tonight on the New South Wales side at least has been done. And look, I'd also like to just, while I get a chance, really thank Glenn and Karen for motivating me and Dave, particularly me, to set this event up for the year and hopefully expand the program over into Victoria on the other side of the Murray River. You know, we don't know a great deal about Sloane's froglet distribution in Victoria. And there's a really great need for us to gain more records and improve our knowledge of this tiny little threatened frog. So thank you very, very much, Glenn and Karen. I really, really appreciate it. And also, just in case I don't, you know, I don't make this clear during the presentation, we are calling for more people to join the Sloane's Champions group, start using the FrogID app and contributing not just data about Sloane's froglet, but all the other frogs that occur in the local area. But I just want to acknowledge that we do have a core group of Sloane's Champions. We have around, I think, 50 to 60 members at the moment. And they really are champions, as you'll see from some of the records I show later. And so I just want to say thank you to all of you. I know some of you are watching. I really appreciate your efforts and your enthusiasm. You know, I love talking to you in person when we can, or via email. So I just wanted to say a big thank you. But on that, I will get on with the presentation. So just a bit of background on Sloane's froglet, who haven't heard about Sloane's froglet. They're a tiny, tiny threatened frog. So they only get up to about a maximum of 2 centimetres, and they're sort of this olivey, greeny brown colour. They really are quite lovely, even though they're quite hard to pick out in wetlands. So they're threatened in New South Wales, but importantly, recently they've been listed under the EPBC Act. So they're actually now threatened at a federal level, so that they are in a spot of trouble. In New South Wales, we used to think that they were they had a fairly broad distribution up into northern New South Wales. But extensive survey work done over many years by Dave Hunter, my colleague, and others, including a researcher from CSU called Alex Knight, have shown that Sloane's froglet is pretty much now only known from a few populations along the Murray River in southern New South Wales. And effectively they are in Albury, around the towns of Albury, so particularly in the suburb of Sagoona, the town of Corowa, the town of Tokemwal, although we actually don't know a great deal about what's happening with Sloane's in Toke, and also sort of a small population along the Murray River corridor from sort of Wodonga to Howlong through to Corowa, I suppose. So they really have a very limited distribution. Very little is known about their distribution in Victoria. We don't really know where they're at. And they probably haven't had a lot of publicity in Victoria to date. So it's really fantastic that records are starting to come through on the Victorian side of the side of the river. So they're interesting in that they're a winter breeding frog. Many species breed in spring and summer, but Sloane's froglet actually breeds helpfully in the dead of winter. So that means that Dave and I spend a lot of our time in winter lurking around wetlands at the dead of night, rugged up as much as we possibly can. And I have to say, Glenn, I would love to be able to listen for frogs from a tent in winter, but I'm not sure we'd get away with it. And an important thing about Sloane's froglet is that they really need these wetlands with a very specific sort of plant structure. And we know that because of the work of a researcher, Alex Knight, who I mentioned before, who did her PhD on Sloane's at Charles Sturt University. And they really need wetlands like the one you can sort of see in this image, where we have this sort of thin-stemmed vegetation. So common rush, or Eleocharis acuta, is generally favoured, and they occur in these very shallow wetlands that fill in autumn and winter. So this structure is really important because it allows Sloane's froglet to attach their little eggs to the thin vegetation. So if you get sort of thick strappy leaf things like your typha or kumbungi, they don't do as well in those sorts of wetlands, and we don't, generally speaking, don't tend to find them in those sorts of wetlands. Fortunately, they will breed in both natural and artificial wetlands. We've seen around Sagoona particularly that they will start using, for example, stormwater basins if they're built in the right way. And that's important because probably the major threat to Sloane's froglet, as Glenn alluded to before, is this loss of wetland habitat. So loss of these beautiful vegetated shallow wetlands, and that's for a variety of reasons. So as I said before, Sloane's can be very tricky to pick out in a wetland. But the cornerstone of our Saving Our Species program here in New South Wales is this extensive monitoring program that Dave and I conduct annually in winter. Fortunately, male frogs use a call to attract females. You can see this male Sloane's froglet, this great photo by Dave up the top here. So he actually has his vocal sac distended because he's amplifying his voice, trying to be as loud as possible to call for a female Sloane's froglet. So that's very helpful for frog ecologists, because we can use those calls to identify who is calling in a wetland and approximately how many are calling. So Dave and I basically spend most of our time in winter at night listening for this call, which I'll play for you, and hopefully you'll be able to hear it. Dave Hunter, can you hear that? Yeah, good. Okay. So it's a short, sharp sort of It's quite distinctive, fortunately. And so the male is calling for a female, and they end up in this posture called amplexus, where the female is laying her eggs and the male is fertilising them as they're laid. And this is just a little bit of footage of Sloane's froglet in amplexus. And if you have a listen, there's lots of other frogs calling in the background. So there's a the spotted marsh frog going whiny little plains froglet. And I think there was a banjo frog at the beginning going bonk, bonk. So it's a pretty large area that Dave and I need to cover, and we have our regular wetlands that we visit each year. But as I said before, it's really important when you're doing threatened species conservation to know where species are. If you don't know where they are, you can't plan for them, you can't manage them. So it's a big area to cover. So a program that we set up in, I think it was actually 2017, with Woolshed Thurgoona Landcare Group and then later Corowa Landcare Group, was the Sloane's Champion Citizen Science Program. And it was basically about engaging the community in learning about Sloane's froglet, because not many people knew that Sloane's froglet occurred in their local community, and also getting the community to help us increase our knowledge of where Sloane's was and possibly wasn't. And in 2019, we expanded that program and partnered with the Australian Museum through its FrogID app and formally set up Sloane's Champions. So if you want to join that group, all you need to do is download the FrogID app. You need to log on to FrogID through your desktop PC, and you can actually search for and join Sloane's Champions under My Groups, and that's how you become a member of Sloane's Champions. So it's a couple of steps, but it is quite straightforward. So we basically encourage our, our champions to visit wetlands in priority areas, so mostly Corowa and Thurgoona, but also now Victoria, and also extending to places like Toke. So we encourage our champions to visit wetlands, record what frogs are calling. That information gets uploaded to the Australian Museum, and it eventually comes back to us. So we actually can develop a map or a picture of where Sloane's has been detected. And we use that to inform our local conservation planning. And Sloane's Champions are awesome. As I said before, they've submitted nearly 6,800 records since we started with FrogID in June 2018. It's a huge number of records. Around 20% of those have been of Sloane's froglet. So we really are increasing our knowledge of where Sloane's is and is not. And I think in a paper Jody and colleagues wrote in 2019, they said that the champions had actually effectively doubled the number of known records of Sloane's froglet. And 89% of the Sloane's froglet records that come through FrogID do come from our core champs. So that's you guys who are joined up to the champions group if you're listening from the audience. So we do receive other records of Sloane's froglet, but most of them do in fact come through our champions group. As well as Sloane's froglet, we've had 13 species detected around Thurgoona and Corowa. There's actually a whole bunch of other species that have been detected because our champs can record anywhere at any time. So we've had records from Western Australia. We've had a few recent records that I suspect may have come from CSU's annual desert trip of water-holding frog and knife-footed frog up in northern New South Wales. We get records from Victoria and even Tasmania. So they do.
Helen, you're accidentally muted.
Yeah, I saw that. I've just unmuted myself, I think.
Yeah, that's good.
Yes, I am. Good, thank you. Sorry. Thank you. Battling with technology already. So at our last update to our champions, which I think was April last year, we'd had about 500 Sloane's Froglet. Around 550 Froglet records came in through that period. We've had another 574 come in from April 2020 to May 2021, which I just think is incredible considering the restrictions we've all been dealing with. So clearly people have been getting their exercise by going out and recording Sloane's Froglet. So well done and thank you. And this map just gives you a bit of an idea of the Sloane's Froglet records relative to the other species that are coming in. So the little pink triangles, which I hope you can see, are all Sloane's Froglet records. There are a few down here. I think that must be out near Baranduda. We've had a scattering of records around Corowa, and then the bulk of them are in Albury. And it makes sense that the bulk of our records come from the Corowa and Albury areas because they are sort of the core known distribution of Sloanes, but also that's where we tend to ask our champions to focus their efforts. And we've had some interesting records come through. This is a smooth toadlet, Uperolia levigata. They're sort of found in Eastern Australia from Queensland down to Victoria. And their call is a short, squelchy sort of ankh, which I will play for you. There's a boo book calling in the back and a parent's. It's kind of an ankh. They breed from September through to April and they attach their eggs to aquatic plants. We've had about 146 champions records of this species from November 2018 through to May 2021, mostly in spring and summer. So it's great that you guys are getting out there and recording at other times of the year. And they've mostly been turning up on Charles Sturt University grounds and a few other locations. I suspect that's because we have some champions who have favourite wetland haunts. I won't name them, but you know who you are. Some other great records that come through are of the giant banjo frog, Limnodynastes interioris. So this is one that Dave and I regularly get a phone call about. Someone is normally concerned that a cane toad has turned up in the yard, and invariably whenever we get there it's actually a very large female giant banjo frog looking very confused about why she's been trapped under a bucket. So they're not cane toads, they're just a big colourful frog. So they're mostly found in inland New South Wales and northern Vic, and they have a deep hollow sort of bonk. I call it like a double bonk bonk. You can hear it sort of deep and hollow. It's different from the other banjo frog. They breed mostly September through to November, and they lay this sort of foamy mass amongst the vegetation. You'll often see those floating foamy masses in the vegetation. They're often Limnodynastes species. So we have 146 records from the champions up until May 2021, so mostly from spring to summer, as I said. We have a few records from North Albury and a few in Corowa, but interestingly, I was looking at the map today and we've been getting a lot from a location that seems to be near Corrine. I'm not sure if it's actually in the township of Corrine or nearby, but to me it looks like the work of one person. I hope you've called in if it's you, but that's fantastic work, thank you. There's a whole bunch of records coming in from this one tiny area, not far sort of north of Corowa. And this is another one that we get a few records of, the eastern banjo frog, Limnodynastes jumerielii. They're very common in southeastern Australia. They spread up into Queensland as well. And they have a resonating sort of hollow bonk, which is why they're sometimes called the banjo frog. And you can hear it's not quite as deep or as resonating as the giant banjo frog. It is more like a banjo being plucked. So they breed mostly in spring and autumn, and again, they lay eggs in this sort of foamy mass that floats amongst the vegetation. So we've had 111 champions records up until May 2021, and they've mostly come from the Thurgoona and Corowa areas. And then this one is a favourite of everyone, Perrin's tree frog, and Glenn reminded me that I should actually include this species in my slides, so thanks Glenn. So they're sometimes called the emerald spotted tree frog or maniacal cackle frog. That's because they have this loud sort of cackling noise. And often when people are describing this frog to us that hangs around the air conditioning vent or that they see on the wall of the house outside, it's usually Perrin's tree frog. And you can see they have these beautiful little yellow sections, these tiny emerald green spots, and this sort of star-shaped iris. They're very beautiful. So they're another spring summer breeding frog. We get quite a lot of records for the champions of them. Around 446 to date, mostly in Albury, but strangely none recorded in Corowa, even though they are most definitely there. So I'm not sure what that's about. And then this one is another very interesting one, which I think Jody might be talking a little bit more about. The eastern dwarf tree frog, or sedge frog, it's sometimes called Latoria felix. So it's mostly found on the eastern coast, but there are some small introduced naturalised populations in Kiwa, the Baranduda and the Osborne's Flat areas, and there's a small population north of Melbourne. So it also breeds in spring or summer, but it's recently been recorded in Albury, and actually it was the Sloane's Champions group that started revealing the first records of the species turning up here. So it has quite a lovely call. It's a beautiful call. And they're a beautiful frog, they're tiny. And they're sometimes referred to as one of these banana box frogs. So they get transported around quite easily in fruit boxes and probably by the nursery trade. So you guys, the champions, have actually been providing the baseline data to see what's happening with this population over time. So at the last meeting we had, so April last year, I think there had been around 20 records. So that's doubled to 44 now. So a few more records, mostly in spring and summer, mostly still on Charles Sturt University grounds around the David Mitchell wetlands, but also at a site sort of east of the Kinross Hotel, which I need to go check out because I'm actually not 100% sure what's there. So I think Karen was going to chime in and just talk a little bit about Sloane's in Wodonga.
Okay. Thanks, Helen, and hi, everyone. This is a little bit of a teaser for those of you who are perhaps hanging out on the Wodonga side of the Murray River. Just wanted to give you a snapshot, zeroing in a little closer. So these are verified record locations for Sloane's around Wodonga, and just kind of want to point out that they're at Baranduda, they're in the Kiwa River floodplain, so including at Kalara, near Yak Creek, and at Ryan's Lagoon. And then across town, we've got some records confirmed in West Wodonga. So for example, the floodplain that's sort of adjacent to Wodonga Creek is quite an interesting place. So these are a bit of a mix of both private and public land. And I'm hoping that this is going to highlight the potential at many other locations. And we're hoping that we'll get some more people helping to investigate in Wodonga and indeed in Victoria more broadly.
Fantastic. Thanks, Karen. And I think these records just really show the value of the Sloane's Champions program. And I think there have even been records from around Wang and possibly Karen thinks she's picked them up in Chiltern and Rutherglen too. So that's fantastic. And look, a little bit of friendly rivalry is always a good thing. So I always like to see how Corowa versus Albury is going. It's like the footy championships, I guess. So at the moment, Corowa is at 7 frog species, Albury's at 13. So Corowa, a little bit of catching up to do. You can do it. I believe in you. Perrin's tree frog is an easy one to add. I should add, though, I'm not picking on Corowa. When you look at the records that come through from Corowa, the vast majority of them are of Sloane's Froglet. So you guys are actually doing a fantastic job of increasing our knowledge of how Sloane's is doing in Corowa. So the number of FrogID records that have come in from Corowa are now 100. It was actually 99, but there was one a bit on the edge of the priority area, so I included it. So you're in triple figures now. Well done. So that's up from 70. And in Thaguna, we're sitting at around 2,570 verified FrogID records. So that's up from 1,500 in April last year. So well done to all of you. I'm pretty amazed at how well you've done, considering the types of restrictions we've all been living with in the last little while. And as I said before, other notable locations include Corrine, or an area sort of near Corrine, with nearly 191 records and 6 species, which is just amazing. And I do suspect it's the work of 1 or 2 people. So yeah, if you ever want to reach out and let me know who you are, please feel free, because I think that's awesome. So this season's focus, welcome Wodonga and Victoria. We really hope that you'll get on board and be keen to join the champs and start recording Sloane's Froglet, hopefully all over Wodonga and surrounds. In New South Wales, we'd like, as far as Sloane's Froglet goes, for you guys to continue focusing on the Albury and Corowa areas. And I'm hoping we have some listeners from Tokemwal or near Tokemwal, and that you guys might be interested in getting involved, because we really need more FrogID records coming in from that area. Of course, in Victoria, everywhere is of interest, so please feel free to record wherever you go, as all champs should. Feel free to visit all sorts of wetlands, so they don't just have to be natural creeks or swamps. Visit created wetlands like stormwater basins, dams. All sorts of sites are of interest. Repeat visits to wetlands in a season are really good. You don't have to just visit it once and then let it go. It's sometimes great to adopt a wetland that you visit every few weeks or so, and that sort of builds a picture for us of what's occurring there, what frogs are calling there over time. And while the Sloane's core breeding season is in winter, so that's when we mostly ask our champs to really focus their wetland visiting efforts, we'd really appreciate it if people were keen to get out there and start recording and listening for the eastern dwarf tree frog, Latoria phalanx. We really want to know a bit more about this species distribution in the local area and what it's doing. And at the moment, you guys, the current champs, are providing pretty much all the information we have on that species distribution in the area. So please, if you're up to it, get out there and start recording. And just finally, from me, the champs, our current champs will remember that top-end toadbusters were our nemesis in the previous year. They were sitting at number 2 or number 3, and it was our mission to knock them off their perch, particularly as they don't even have a profile picture. And look at that, we did. So we've now beat top-end toadbusters. However, somehow we've fallen to position 4, rank 4. Really, it's rank 3, because I'm pretty certain that James's test group is a bit of a dodgy, So really, it's probably number 3. But what we want to do is go from there to there, please. So our new nemesis are the Blue Mountains Frogs Friends. They also don't have a profile picture, so I'm not sure how professional they are. So let's try and knock them off their perch and move up a level. So to do it, all you need to do is go online, log in and join the Sloane's Froglet, Sloane's Champions group, and start recording. Bother your friends and family till they join as well. Do repeat visits to wetlands and feel free to record all year. And again, thank you so much to all of these groups who have been major supporters of Sloane's Champions, and particularly to the FrogID and the Australian Museum and Woolshed Laguna Landcare Group and Corowa Landcare Group. You guys are amazing. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Helen. That was fantastic, Helen and Karen. Really appreciate your insights. And I don't actually know Helen all that well, but I've learnt something tonight, that she will make any excuse to get to a pub, is basically what I've gleaned from her discussion. So the Kinross she shall be. So thanks very much, Helen. And we'll be reiterating some of those components throughout the evening as well. And we're a little bit tight for time, so I noted that Jennifer Showers has put in a chat line. I'm really appreciative of Ant Packer for her response, and I think Ant's being probably very good in terms of not naming specific brand name herbicides, but I'm happy for Dave or Helen to add to that chat line in terms of what's the issue, or are there issues with herbicides. But I'll just add in a verbal sense too, that there's different ways to skin a cat too, particularly with wetlands and with their drying, wetting cycles. And so we can be conscious of the life cycle elements that Helen referred to and avoid some of the really critical periods. And so if we're dealing with a wetland in its dry phase, we're probably less likely to have impacts on the frogs. So take into account timing as much as the actual herbicide as well. So thank you very much. Now, I'd like to hand over to Dr. Jody Rowley. Come on down.
Thank you very much. I will share my screen. Oops, that was the wrong button. How come we can do this 1,000 times for a year and a half, and as soon as we have to do it live, okay. All right, so everyone can see a photo of Sloane's froglet right there.
Yep, we're good to go. Thanks, Jody.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for having me speak today. I first of all want to say that I have never seen or heard in person a Sloane's froglet, and I was hoping that this event would allow me to come for the very first time, probably a little while ago, and see these guys in person. But alas, I'm going to miss out in this time. I have, however, heard a lot of Sloane's froglets, thanks to everybody out there submitting calls of them to the FrogID project. So I've had to steal this photo from my colleague Stephen Marnie, but one day I hope to see this amazing little frog myself. So I'm going to start, I guess, a bit of the why FrogID, and then talk a little bit about FrogID and some of the things that we're finding thanks to people out there like yourself. And I must say that you guys are particularly my, I guess, my source of inspiration when I say that people are willing to stand out in the freezing cold in a swamp at night to record frogs. I'm thinking of you in particular, because I know it's awfully cold when Sloane's froglet are calling. But overall, frogs are in a lot of trouble, and that's the reason that we created FrogID, or one of the main reasons. So in Australia, we have at the moment 243 native species of frog. So in any one place, you might get 3 or 4 species, particularly in the drier areas, up to potentially, if you were a superhero and went all night, you might be able to get 30 or more species in one night. So quite a diversity of frogs adapted to rainforest, to desert, and there's a lot of good frogs in your area, but they are in trouble. So we've already lost at least 4 species of frogs in Australia to extinction, and several others are missing, feared extinct. And we have many more, about 36 species that are kind of perched on the edge of extinction. So it's not great for frogs. Australia has a pretty bad track record, but globally, I guess we're not alone. So frogs on a global scale are also incredibly threatened. So about 42% of all frog species that are known, or all amphibian, including frog species, are threatened with extinction. So they're in a heck of a lot of trouble. But I guess the big question is, I guess, so what? Well, frogs are important for ecosystems. we should care about them because they are fantastic indicators of ecosystem health. So frogs are very sensitive to any kind of environmental change. So when things are out of sync, then they start to disappear. So if we monitor our frogs, we can actually get a decent indication of environmental health as well. They're also incredibly important in food webs and energy flows. So even though frogs themselves are tiny, their biomass can be the biggest in many ecosystems. So if you were to make a pile of all the frogs, a pile of all the reptiles, birds, mammals, these hypothetical piles in your mind, in many ecosystems, the frog pile would actually be the biggest pile of all the vertebrates. And so therefore it's not surprising, you know, they're eating tons of invertebrate species, including pests. The tadpoles are eating algae, helping keep our waterways clear. And they're also eaten by a lot of things. So frogs help support birds, mammals, reptiles. And so they're a really, really important part of the ecosystem. And in places where we've lost frogs, which unfortunately globally we have nearly lost frogs from some places, nothing else steps up and fills the role of frogs. So we need them, definitely. Now, there are some more selfish reasons we might want frogs. So each frog has kind of a chemical cocktail on its skin, and they use these to stop them from getting infected by all sorts of diseases. And increasingly, we are investigating frogs for our own human medicine. So antivirals, antibacterials, antifungals, even contraceptives and drug delivery is all coming out of frogs. And so when we lose a species of frog, we lose the potential to maybe save ourselves down the track. And almost all of Australia's frog species are found nowhere else in the world. And crazily, we still don't even know how many species of frog we have in Australia. So there's likely to be another 2 or 3 species described and officially named in Australia this year alone. So it's crazy. Our frogs are in trouble. We don't know much about them. And even for the species that we do know, as you all know, we have a very poor understanding of them. So one of the biggest obstacles we face, aside from the obvious huge threats, disease, habitat loss, climate change, is that we actually don't know much about them. So when we're trying to decide what we need to do, often it's based upon best guesses. This map in the background is actually a map of all the records of frogs. And this was, I actually took this screen cap before FrogID, so it's better now. But this is from the Atlas of Living Australia from New South Wales. You can sort of see Sydney, Wollongong. And these are the official records of frogs in Australia. And one of the things that I was noticing at the time was there are hundreds of kilometres of Australia with no official frog records at all. And so when it comes to planning the next national park or where a development should be, frogs aren't being considered in conservation decisions. So the other cool thing about frogs that helps us get by this is the fact that each frog species has a different call. And these are 2 species of frogs. They're stream frogs from Eastern Australia, Litoria barringtonensis and Litoria philocroa. And they look very, very similar, so similar that sometimes I'm not able to tell them apart visually in the field by looking at these frogs. The differences are incredibly subtle. But by actually listening to their calls, you don't even have to see the frog. You don't have to kind of get in a swamp, disturb the habitat. I mean, you certainly don't want to touch the frog because you might, transmit diseases, but their calls are as different as day and night. And it makes sense because frogs don't want to waste their time getting the wrong species. They want to make sure they get the right species. So they all have different calls. And the thing that enables these calls to be so useful in monitoring is the fact that we're all carrying around this amazing piece of technology these days that lets us do all this data collection with very little effort. And that's why FrogID was created. So it's a national citizen science project. It's all based around a free app for your smartphone. It does have a field guide with photos and calls, and it is the most up-to-date field guide. So we also know the species that are coming up to be described, and as soon as they are, we will update the app so that you'll always have the latest information. We're also looking to update with more fun facts about species. So hopefully we can jazz up the Sloane's Froglet account. So if anyone has any advice on what you would like in there, we can jazz that up. We also often include calls that have been submitted. We add them to the species profile so that you'll be able to listen to your call, and other people will be able to listen to your call as well. But the main reason we have FrogID is a tool so that you can record and submit the calls of frogs. It's not yet a Shazam. So every single submission is identified by one or more frog experts based at the Australian Museum. So it's really simple. You just listen out for a frog, you hear it, and you do the kind of crazy frog ID pose. So yeah, press record for 20 to 60 seconds. So just hit the big red button. You've got to do at least 20 seconds or it'll start all over again. And then you can basically just sort of press submit, submit, submit if you want. You don't have to enter things, but you can add notes, you can add photographs, you can tell us the kind of habitat the frog was in. And then once you submit that, it gets submitted to the FrogID database, where somebody like myself, which is an illustration of me but with glasses on, in there, we can see absolutely everything. So we can listen to the call. This is one of my submissions of a red-backed toadlet. So you can listen to the call, you can see exactly on a map where it is. It's got the latitude, the longitude, and also a measure of accuracy. So the phone, even this gorge, I had no mobile reception, and I was down a gorge that there was no frog records at all that existed in this gorge, but my phone still knew where it was to six meters, which is pretty good. I didn't submit any photos, but I did tell FrogID that it was in a natural area and in a stream and a creek. I had no notes. And then somebody's gone and identified that as what I said it was, which was a red-backed toadlet. So it's super easy. And, you know, if there's any queries in the future of, oh, really was that, we can go back and listen to it again. So it's a lot like a museum voucher where you have that kind of recording of the frog that you can go back and listen to. So it's made as easy as possible. I mean, I always struggle with the sort of, I really want to learn birds, but a lot of the sort of eBird data, I'm like, I just don't know what that is. I can add kookaburras and magpies, but then like, you know, tiny brown birds, I'm out. So we make FrogID easy. You don't need to know what it is. We'll take care of that for you, but it is nice when you do tick the frogs. So we've been going for almost 4 years. When we launched FrogID, I didn't know if it would just be, you know, my grandmother and my best friend that would end up using it. And I've been blown away by how many people have taken up FrogID and submitted frog records. So we've had hundreds of thousands of people download FrogID, but we've had about 25,000 people actually submit an audio recording, which is pretty fantastic. We've had 277,000 or so submissions as of today, which has resulted in about 440,000 records of frogs. So not all submissions have frogs in them. We get a lot of crickets and insects, and that's fine because they often are really hard to tell apart. But then other submissions, of course, have heaps of frogs. And I think maximum number of species calling in a recording so far still is 12. So a single recording might result in 12 records. And so far we've got 204 species. You can see it is a bit of a population map of Australia, and that's part of citizen science. So our aim is to fill those gaps as well. So if you sort of divided Australia into half a decimal degree grids, we've only got 30% of Australia covered with frogs, and we need to get all of Australia covered with frogs. So that's definitely an aim for the future. But it is remarkable. So in less than 4 years, and we're more than 75% now, so we're approaching, and we'll probably pretty much get there, doubling the number of frog records that exist in Australia in the last 240 years. And these ones all come with a latitude or longitude. You can listen to the frog calls again. And so it is a remarkable achievement. And that is thanks to people like you, which is amazing. So FrogID is increasing. Then this is the number of records since launch. You can see that there is a very seasonal sort of up and down. For the most of the East Coast, it might have a little bit to do with people not wanting to go out in the cold, but except for this group of people. But certainly that most frog species along the East Coast breed in summer. I guess the opposite is true in Perth. We tend to get more recordings in winter, but for Australia as a whole, we definitely get more and more recordings in summer. And you can see signatures of drought and fire on there. So you can see in late 2020, all the calls started going down. Everyone was reporting that no frogs were calling. In February, that was 2019. In February last year, it rained and we got a lot of recordings. And it was kind of insane how many recordings we got in FrogID week in November last year. And we're hoping to beat that this year. The number of species, not surprisingly, there was a really sharp increase at the start as everyone got all the common species, but we've hit a little bit of a plateau. A lot of the species that we still have to get via FrogID occur in really remote areas, might call only when it rains, which might be really unpredictable and infrequent. And unfortunately, of course, some of these species are extinct and we're actually unlikely to ever hear the call again, which is awful. But FrogID, all this data, what does it do? What are we using it for? What has it revealed? You know, aside from, you know, understanding the distribution of a species and understanding sort of when frogs breed, we're looking at it, and I use the we as in the scientific community, but particularly the Australian Museum, using it to address questions like climate change, drought and fire. So we didn't actually realise how important FrogID would be for understanding the impacts of the 2019-2020 bushfires on Australia's frogs. You know, I watched it on the news. I watched these fires. I obviously breathe in the air. I didn't think that the frogs would be able to survive. I was absolutely horrified. I didn't know what would happen to all my field sites. I managed to just about get into the field, and then as soon as that happened, COVID restrictions came down on us, and so there was this massive fear of how are we going to understand the impacts of this fire if we can't get out there. And even though scientists, for the most part, couldn't get out there and study the impacts of these fires on frogs, everybody across the fire zone recorded hundreds of frog calls. And we were able to use this data to provide, I think, one of the first, if not the first, sort of data-based papers on the impacts of the fires on Australia's frogs, or any kind of biodiversity, which is all thanks to people out there recording frogs in their backyard. And it was a really good news picture, so that revealed widespread short-term persistence of Australia's frogs, and sort of going out into the field afterwards, certainly not for all frogs, and we do not know the long-term implications of these fires, but you know, I've also seen at some of my field sites more frogs than I'd seen in a fair while, which is pretty amazing. So my fingers are crossed that this good news continues, and we're working on another paper using FrogID to look at the longer term situation. And so it gives me a lot of hope that frogs can be really resilient. And of course, frogs have dealt with drought and fires in the past. It's just the scale of this and then everything else that's going on that's likely to, I guess, tip them over the edge. But it's all thanks to citizen science that we know about this, everyone out there recording on their phone. We're also examining the impacts of land use change, and a couple of papers that came out in the last year or so, for example, used FrogID data to find that 70% of the frog species that we had enough data from FrogID for were actually intolerant of human modified habitats. So they were less likely to be found the more the habitat was modified, which I guess is somewhat intuitive, but 70% is pretty hideous. And a lot of the other species that we didn't have enough data for are probably even more intolerant. We also found that if you just looked at kind of the urban areas, the cities, that the number of frog species in our cities was less than half that of adjacent natural areas. So although this sounds horrifying, we're now working to look to see, okay, what do we need to do in our urban areas? How can we create more frog-friendly habitats? And that's thanks to all these recordings coming in. FrogID has also revealed disappearing frogs. So one of the first findings, because of the volume of submissions from Sydney that we found, was that there was a stark absence of the green tree frog, which used to be really common throughout Sydney. And that's now missing from most of Sydney, occasional record here and there. And so we're looking into what we can do about that. And more recently, the magnificent brood frog, which occurs up on the Atherton Tablelands in North Queensland, a local community group, very much like the Sloane's Champions, is actually using FrogID as a tool to re-monitor survey sites. So sites that the frog was known at the past, because it's facing an increasing challenge from development from wind farms that are impacting its habitat. So the FrogID data is actually, thanks to the people that are recording the frogs, the best data that we have now. And this data has been provided in advance to the Queensland government so they can fully consider the impacts of these wind farms. FrogID is providing us amazing information on how the cane toad is moving, and hopefully will help us understand what kind of impact it's actually having on frogs. It doesn't seem to have the horrible impact we thought that it would do on frogs, but FrogID is helping understand both the kind of invasion edges, and also helping detect when a cane toad is accidentally transported outside of its sort of normal range, or the range that's moving itself, by hitchhiking. And we'll hopefully be able to detect any incursions from other frog species, including the black spine toad from Asia, which is often intercepted at our borders. So we're keeping our ears out for things that might be a big concern. And something that I wasn't really thinking was a huge thing until FrogID, and is very relevant in this situation, is certainly that we're finding a lot of native species far outside their native ranges. And so hitchhiking and establishing populations, whether they're on produce, whether we assume they're accidental introductions, but certainly the graceful tree frog is kicking off in Sydney now. So that's, yeah, very interesting finding. And so we can investigate what's going on with these guys. And of most importance, we are finding that the dwarf tree frog is actually expanding dramatically. So before FrogID, it was known from some populations around Melbourne and sort of into northern Victoria. But since then, obviously, it's expanded into the Albury region. We're also detecting populations throughout Canberra. And one of the interesting things is that there's sort of a bit of an absence of legislation or of an understanding of what to do, because it's a native species. What do you do? But FrogID and everyone out there using FrogID is helping us understand what's going on, and we're working with governments to try and figure out what to do. FrogID is also being used in species discovery. So one of Australia's most recently sort of renamed frogs, Spalding's rocket frog, which has been described as, it sounds like a chicken pushing a lawnmower. And I encourage you all to listen to this frog call in the FrogID app. But we're also using it to study a whole bunch of other species and potentially end up describing new species in the process. And that's both part of the FrogID team at the Australian Museum, but researchers across Australia asking for the data and using that in their research. And if you want to check out some of the publications from FrogID, you can check out the science page, the links at the bottom there. And that's primarily thanks to a group of amazing students, which for some reason happen to all be female. So the Australian Museum is doing a lot of women-led research using FrogID. So there's at the moment 3 PhD students and 2 honours students that are using exclusively or in part FrogID data to help understand and conserve frogs, which is really fantastic. So hopefully they'll be producing a lot of really important work thanks to all your submissions. And FrogID, we provide annual exports to the Atlas of Living Australia, which is coming up next month, and to all the state wildlife atlases. And it's also being incorporated into government recommendations for monitoring and also into many of the federal conservation assessments, which is really fantastic. So we are getting people, and particularly environmental consultants, using FrogID to monitor, so noting that it's for a BAM assessment, which is great. But back to this little guy, which is where we all started. I use the Sloane's Champions and this little frog in a lot of my talks as an example of exactly what we wanted FrogID to do. It's only going to be successful from the ground up. We can create an app all we want, but if it's not owned by and used by the community and used for conservation, which is exactly what's happening with this project, and that's thanks to Helen and Dave and Glenn and everybody involved, you know, it's just amazing, and we thank you. You're making a real contribution to understanding a tiny little frog that looks almost exactly the same as a very common frog and calls in the depths of winter, so you have to stand out at night recording it. But every single contribution is completely noted, and you know, we thank you so much for getting out there, and we hope that it is used to be, you know, the data will be really important in better informing conservation for this tiny little frog. So thank you so much. And not only this frog, but obviously, as Helen was mentioning, all the other frogs that are being recorded at the same time. And as Helen and I have mentioned, one of these frogs obviously is the eastern dwarf tree frog. And so I think we're going to be at a very interesting spring and summer trying to see where these guys are and how they're spreading. So if we look at the records up until recently, so I haven't checked to see if they're calling yet, but I can definitely do that, of this little guy outside the range. So you can see the native range of the species kind of along the coast. We've now got records in the ACT, the records that were in northern Victoria, which have been since the late 90s, early 2000s. They've now kind of expanded up into the Albury region. Melbourne is full of the little guys. And so it really is, I guess, something that we need to really monitor. Last year, we also got a record at Griffith, and we've got some populations out, pretty well outside their known native range, which is potentially really bad news. So even they are a gorgeous frog and they are native. If you just look at the FrogID records over the last kind of 4 summers, you can see that we are getting more. So the records of Latoria phalanx, of the dwarf tree frog, are in black. The other FrogID records are in salmon, I guess is the colour. And so what you can kind of see, though, is that we are getting a lot more FrogID records. So it's a little bit hard to tease sometimes, like what is just because we're getting more records and what is because they're spreading. But we definitely believe that they are indeed spreading. And this could have some serious implications. So they're now coming into contact with other species that they have never in their previous previous years been in contact with, and one of those is the Sloane's froglet. So it doesn't occur natively where the Sloane's froglet is. So what kind of interactions it might have, potentially disease transmission. These guys seem pretty robust to the amphibian chytrid fungus. I guess we're going to have to find out. So monitoring what is going on is going to be really vital in these coming months. And I guess just on an ending, I want to say how thankful I am for everybody out there that is submitting a recording or telling their friends about FrogID. I think that, Dave and Helen and anyone that's sort of involved in conservation, it can be very depressing watching some of these, species and not knowing what's going on. But the knowledge that you're willing to stand out there in the pouring rain, record frog calls, and we have these army of people that have joined the fight for biodiversity conservation and that care and that are actually contributing really, really important scientific data is absolutely remarkable, and never has this been more important than now. Where scientists are mostly stuck, especially the ones based in Sydney, like myself. We can't get out there. We need you to be out there. Frogs have faced drought, they've faced fire, and as many of you know, that currently along Eastern Australia in particular, they're facing a mass mortality event. And so we really need your help to understand how our frogs are doing, and we're so thankful for everything that you have done. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks so much, Jody. Your enthusiasm is palpable, and I just can't wait to get into the Spalding's rocket tree frog call. And I know I'm going to say to everyone, please get into the Sloanes, but I'm really keen to see if it was like, if we had a website, I'm sure there'd be the number of hits on the Spalding's rocket tree frog call will be interesting to see. And there's so many good messages that's come out of your presentation, Jody, and it's really interesting, and I'm sure Dave will perhaps back this up in a moment, that you mentioned that there's so many, 70% of frog species aren't really tolerant to human disturbance or human occupation and habitat modification. And interestingly, Sloane's is one of those, and it was an opportunity to dovetail back into a question that Rachel has popped on, and I'm really appreciative for everyone to provide comments and answers to the questions. And I'm sure that Helen and Dave will be able to back up later about the development components, but I know they've had really good experience with having, and I know we don't initially want to have development happen and lose habitat, but they've had some really good success in terms of managing modification, managing stormwater drainage systems, and this species is one which can handle human disturbance. And I'm not advocating it, but I'm just saying there's ways in which we can we can manage it. And I think it's a really good take-home message. And we haven't got time, but I've got great stories of banana box frogs, and I've had an interesting one with a toad that came into our office one time. But I haven't got time to continue with it here. It'll have to be in after hours at the Kinross pub stories, because it is a bit funny. So thank you very much again, and congratulations, and we're really appreciative of your super contribution to frog biology, and in particular we're focusing on the app and the incredible value that that's having, and as you're saying, giving the opportunity for a whole lot of people like us, community people, the opportunity to really contribute, and even though we're not necessarily seeing the frogs having a really valuable contribution to understanding an improved understanding of distribution and abundance. So thanks once again, Jody, and please keep putting some questions and comments, and really keen for people to help answer the questions as they go along. I'm clock watching again though, so I'm going to pass over to Dave, and Dave's got a fantastic affinity with frogs also, and he's going to run us through some of the idiosyncrasies. And Jody mentioned about the seasonality, and I'm sure Dave's going to pick up on that, and I'm pretty blown away to have the prospect of 12 different species in one recording, and I'm sure Dave's going to pick on and perhaps one of the reasons why Helen and Jody mentioned doing repeat surveys at different times of the year is part of the reason why we're going to get a huge number of frogs over a period of time. But I'll hand over to Dave. Thanks very much, Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. And look, I just wanted to say how much I enjoyed Jody's presentation. That was absolutely fantastic. And also, FrogID and the results that are coming in, it really is thanks to the people out there using the app that Jody started, FrogID. But FrogID wouldn't happen without Jody. And so there's, we all have should extend a massive thanks for Jody for developing this app, making it actually happen, because I can tell you now, without Jody, it wouldn't have happened. And yeah, I'm sure you can appreciate that. Look, there's probably lots of crazy cat ladies around the countryside, but there really is only one crazy national frog lady, and her name's Jody. So FrogID is absolutely fantastic, and everything else she does.
Oh man, and I'm a crazy dog lady. There's one right next to me, and you probably heard it jumping around before.
All right, so I'm just gonna share all this with you. Share screen.
Yeah, that's good, mate. You're on.
Yep. Okay. I also want to share. Look, yeah. So through the various presentations, there was a lot of talk about how you might go about undertaking frog surveys, and so hold on, I've got various things popping up on the screen here. So I'm just going to run through a little bit of Frog Monitoring 101 to help people think about how they might use FrogID to sort of maximise the value of the results that are coming in and maximise your experience with the app. And so just a few little things that'll help fine-tune your approach to using FrogID and getting the best results. So definitely use FrogID. That's really critical. And I think that's the great thing about FrogID is you're generating really robust data that's contributing to Sloane's champions and contributing to all this other amazing broader work that Jody talked about. But it's also a great tool to help you learn the different species and learn about the local frog fauna. So it's not just a recording device, it's actually also a really fantastic education device that you can use here, but not only just here, but anywhere that you go in Australia and learn about the frog fauna. We're keen to have people visit wetlands. Helen talked a lot about multiple visits to the same wetlands, and so frogs, they don't necessarily always call at all the time, and they certainly vary in when they call across different seasons. We talked a little bit earlier about how Sloane seems to be a really winter specialist calling species. And, you know, just how important that is for our understanding of local frog fauna and biodiversity in general is, you know, we've, until we sort of became more aware of the situation with Sloanes and we're paying more attention to it, there were various biodiversity assessments undertaken in the region, and they typically looked at frogs come the start of spring and a bit later into spring. And what we found is that all these biodiversity assessments actually missed what is probably the most important species in this area, which is Sloanes. And so having a better understanding, which largely came through Alex Knight's PhD work of when Sloanes is primarily calling, has allowed us to then target our efforts and get better information. Sloanes is great in that they can call any time of the day, but we do generally find that they are at their peak calling activity in those few hours after dark. But look, honestly, even a still sunny day when it's pleasant to walk around wetlands and parks and wherever else, you often get Sloanes calling through the day. So, so yeah, use FrogID at any time. Surveying for frogs, we're reliant on, well, using this method, we're reliant on hearing them calling. And so things like when it's windy, if the wind is noisy or if the rain is noisy, then it can become less clear hearing the species. But also if you're making recordings for some, you know, it's good to have good conditions for the calling, because it makes it a lot easier for Jody's team and herself, who are listening to all these thousands of recordings that are coming in. And one thing that Helen and I have been doing as part of this program is we married up with the Woolshed Thaguna Landcare group, and we've put a bit of information about surveying for frogs, in particular the Sloane's Champions project, on that website. So visit that website for a bit more information on the Sloane's Champions survey methodology. So just also be mindful of procedures that will keep you safe and also keep others happy and safe. So be mindful if you're accessing or approaching private property, particularly if you're doing it at night. Being someone who's spent the last few decades spending a lot of time creeping around the landscape at night, I know how, well, I couldn't tell you how many times I've had suspicious looks or even very concerned looks from people, or people chasing after me, wondering what the hell I'm doing in the neighbourhood, looking a bit suspicious. When I tell them that it's all good fun frogging activity, they're usually happy. But yeah, look, if you want to access a site that you think might be private property, so probably best to find out whose property it is and get permission. Always tell someone where you're going, particularly if you're going out at night. And one thing I do want to say is if you're frogging at night using FrogID from out of your car, just be really careful where you're parking off the side of the road if there's a lot of traffic around, etc. I think that's one of the important sort of safety issues when you're using FrogID. Where, as you've probably heard about elsewhere, and also from what Jody was talking about, one of the big problems for our frogs is pathogens that get spread around the landscape. So generally we try to use pretty clean hygiene protocols of always maintaining clean boots. But in particular, we're very careful when we handle frogs. And so you can't actually get a scientific license to work with frogs without agreeing to use very strict hygiene protocols, such as wearing gloves and so forth. But just be mindful of the fact that one of the big problems for frogs is the spreading of pathogens. And so we try to reduce the possibility that through our activities that might happen. And of course, with current COVID, the current COVID situation, stick to the guidelines in terms of where you can go and who you can go with, and distancing, etc. So look, one of the great things, and some of this is sort of going back over what you've already heard. One of the things about surveying for a frog is that to survey for one, you really need to know them all, and you really need to know what different species you're listening to. And I can't see. It was there. Tell me if you can hear this, Helen. Clearly not.
No.
No, it's a bit odd because earlier my share.
You might have to make the calls, Dave.
Think you do.
Sounds like I will.
We thought this might happen.
That's right.
Feedback.
All right. So anyway, you heard earlier that you know, the way FrogID works is that you're listening for the calls. I think I've moved forward unintentionally. I wanted to go back, which it's not letting me do.
Just click on the page and move back, maybe.
Oh, there it goes.
There
yep.
you go.
So look, so it's actually more difficult than it sounds. So for example, with Sloane's Froglet, each year when Helen and I go out to start our Sloane surveys, you actually do need to recalibrate your ear for Sloanes. And in particular, this little guy, Plains Froglet, just next to Sloane's here in the photos, depending on what Plains Froglet's doing, and in particular, depending on the temperature, can sound very similar to Sloane's. And we've had lots and lots of people excitedly telling us how they've found, you know, the greatest new Sloane's population, only to then hear a recording of a loud Plains Froglet colony. And in fact, I've actually had a lot of expert consultants do just this, which is one of the reasons why I've pushed very hard in our agency that a requirement of undertaking fauna impact assessment surveying for targeted frog species is that they use FrogID. This is just yet another fantastic application of the FrogID, is that you're not only having experts check your calls, check the calls that are in the recordings, but Jody then has that recording that's archived and is a reference point that we can go back to if we want to query the identification or query some other aspect of the situation. So this little guy here, Plains Froglet, is definitely the Sloane's mimic. And I mentioned temperature before, and this is one of the really interesting things with frogs. So you have the standard advertisement call for frogs. So in the case of Sloane's Froglet, it's and then the standard advertisement call for Plains Froglet, which is But frog calls are very influenced, because they're a cold-blooded animal. The characteristic of the frog call is very influenced by the temperature of the frog at that particular point in time. And so, for example, Plains Froglet, which will often call in summer when it's really warm, all of a sudden becomes this sharp which sounds a bit like So there are lots of misidentifications of Sloane's Froglet because of people hearing Plains Froglet when the little Plains Froglet is really warm. And so anyway, that's just an example of one reason why you need to become really familiar, intimately familiar with the frog's calls and their variation. The other thing too is we've been talking a lot about the advertisement call of frogs, but that's not the only call that frogs make. Frogs, particularly male frogs, also give a aggression call, or they might also give a threat call. But so, for example, the advertisement call of Plains Froglet is a but the males, when they're trying to sort out their territory and sort of biff onto other males, give a So it's a calling out to the females, and then telling other males to bugger off. And again, we often get people saying, oh, we've got Sloane's here, I've got a recording, and there'll just be this loud ongoing chorus of Plains Froglet, and then all of a sudden at some point there'll be a and they'll be like, there it is. And it's like, well, actually, no, that's just a pissed off Plains Froglet telling another male to bugger off. And the other thing too is being intimate with the calls. The other challenge there is picking the calls out amongst the chorus of lots of different calls. And once you start doing this, and you know, for those who regularly go out and listen to frog choruses and try and pick the different ones out, it's amazing how you'll be in a spot, you'll hear this loud chorus of different frog calls, and you've then got to work your ears into working in that narrow range of the Sloane's froglet call. And your brain won't pick up Sloane's froglet until you somehow sort of work it into that right sort of listening sort of frame. And then all of a sudden it's like, there it is. It was there all along, but it took me a while to pick it out from amongst the loud chorus of all the other frogs. And anyway, Helen has already played a lot of these frogs for you. There's some interesting ones in amongst here. The Bibrans Toadlet. Jody's talked about describing new species using FrogID and other work that she's doing. Bibrans Toadlet is a local species that is currently under taxonomic review. There's every likelihood that the Bibrans Toadlet found around the Albury area and going through down into Wodonga and surrounds is going to be more restricted than we currently realise, and may even possibly also be a species warranting listing as threatened. And so this is another good example of where using FrogID, getting information now on Bibrans Toadlet is going to help us, should in the event that this species becomes listed, help us better understand what's the current status, where is it, and just using all the different techniques that Jody talked about earlier, start to understand what its habitat and conservation requirements are. So I'm going to finish up there, and again just acknowledge all the different partners that are involved in this. It really is, this is a fantastic project. This is the one threatened species project that I'm involved in, where involving the community, the fate of Sloane's froglet really does rely on the broader community. We've seen through Karen's work and the map that was shown about how Sloane's is dotted right through the urban environment in Wodonga, and we've heard Jody talk about how frogs don't necessarily persist in landscapes that have been highly modified by humans. But she then also made the point, and Glenn also made this point, we can have species like Sloane's froglet persist in areas that we're living, but it just requires us to understand their requirements and cater to it, ensure that the right sort of wetlands and connectivity across the landscape persists. And I believe we can do it, but it's not going to happen without everyone's help. And I'll finish there. Thank you.
Good on you. Thanks very much, Dave. And look, through personal experience, we keep espousing the virtues of the app, and I'm a guinea pig case in point, and I reckon I've gone like everyone from the stage one of all frogs sound the same to I can recognise there's a heap of different species calling, but I don't know what the hell they are, to I know that one, and I know that one, and I know that one, but I'm not sure on these couple. And so it's a really good progression. And Dave said that it's fantastic for Jody and the verification team, but it's incredibly valuable for you, the individual, you, the citizen scientist, because every record that you submit, it comes back to you with the verifications. And I'm not sure that was mentioned, but you've got the opportunity of actually selecting what you think's there. You get the positive feedback, or you get the feedback, and you've got that record, and it's incredibly valuable to be able to play your calls from your favourite wetland or dam, or from a myriad of other places. And yeah, really powerful tool. So yeah, I absolutely concur with the power of the app and the power of the community to be able to participate in such a program. So thanks heaps, Dave. Really appreciate your calls as much as your valued skills and experience. I'm recognising that we're sort of pushing the limits of time, and so I might ask people if they're keen, they can just hang in there for a little bit more. I'll sort of do the closing bits now, but then open it up a little bit at the end. So there is a where to from here, and it's probably just reiterating that there's a really great opportunity for the northerners, the Corowa, Bullshit, Vaguna people to continue their great work, and there's probably a little bit of a challenge being put out there for the southerners, the people on the south side of the border, to be able to match and counter some of the fantastic records that have been put in by people north of the border. And as we've been saying, it's really an information gathering. It's gathering really good information, and as Dave has really demonstrated, that we can probably better manage and conserve this significant species. And as Jody illustrated, where there's one, there's many, and often where the habitat engineers that frogs are, they're the engine room of our ecosystems, and so we can really do fantastic things if we're protecting our waterways and our wetlands and the associated habitat. So it'd be really keen for you to contribute data to sign up. We've got all your data. We have got your bank details by virtue of your Eventbrite registration. Perhaps not the last bit, but the beauty of it is that we are able to, and Karen, I really want to especially thank Karen, who's been doing a huge amount of work in the background to get tonight off in terms of the technology, and she has your details, and so we'll be able to send out an email. It'll be a blind CC email to you to be able to give you the opportunity, if you're not already a Sloane's champion, or if you haven't got details, to provide the opportunity to, some more info will come your way. And as Helen's already demonstrated, there's a keenness on our respective, our collective behalf to improve our common understanding. And so in terms of future, perhaps live meetings and being outside, and the opportunities there at the moment to, as the speakers have mentioned, even though Sloane's is tapering off in terms of its seasonality of calling, there's some really fantastic species that are about to arc up. And by the time the next winter comes around, if we've been collectively playing with the app and getting used to its features, and there's incredible features, and I really, Karen tutored me through doing the value adding, putting the notes, adding the photos. It's really powerful for you, the contributor, but really great at the back end too for the verification. And I'm sure by the time the next winter comes around and the next full-on Sloane season, we'll have a raft more people to be able to contribute to that. So I want to really appreciate and thank our speakers, Helen, Dave, Karen and Jody in particular. Like, they've just done a power of work, and not just tonight, but it's their knowledge and years of work and study that we're benefiting from tonight, and we're piggybacking on, and we're really appreciative of your long-term contributions, not just for tonight. So that's really great. And I want to particularly thank you, the people who are there in our audience. And we keep saying this sort of loosely term, we're talking about citizen science, but we're really appreciative and think that, you know, there's many a champion in amongst the audience now, and there's budding champions in amongst us too. And it's a powerful beast getting the bug, as Karen Retra is a really great demonstration of, and it's a really great thing to get a new passion, and I'm sure many of you will. So thank you, a big thanks to everyone here tonight in amongst us. So we've sort of had on and off 50 people in the audience, which is great. I reckon that's about it for me. One last thing I'll mention, I don't know that's come out clearly, is Dave mentioned about the ability for this species to hang in there in human environments and relatively modified environments. This species does well in some really fantastically managed farmland, so grazed properties where there's saturated paddocks and wetlands. And so I really want to emphasise that land carers, farmers, people on the land have got a really valuable contribution to play, and really often what they've got to do is just keep doing what they're doing, because if they've got great habitat there, it's fantastic. So I want to really recognise the landholders amongst us, and for those who are not landholders, who are speaking to landholders, it's a really great opportunity to have a demonstration of the private land conservation contribution that farmers can have, and we can do the same on our managed Crown lands too. That there's some tweaking through the knowledge of Dave and Helen and their experiences. We can actually value add to the habitat to benefit species like Sloane's and a whole host of others. I haven't been looking at the chat line, so I'm not sure if Karen, Helen, or Dave, or Jody, would you like to have any further comments, or if there's questions that I've missed, please do so.
Yeah, just one thing I'd like to say, which is that, you know, Glenn made some really important points there, and you know, we've all seen the population expansion, human population expansion in this area, and you know, a lot of what we've been talking about with regards to Sloane's, the way forward is that we really need to marry up our ability to live in this area and have urban expansion, but also ensure that species, particularly Sloane's froglet, persists, because it's such an important area for the species. And I really encourage you all to you know, be vigilant with respect to the developments and things that you see going on in your community, and make sure you feel like you've got a voice in talking to council or, you know, local government or state level government, if you feel that a message needs to get out there regarding provisions required for Sloane's froglet in this area. You know, it's been an important, Sloane's Champions has been an important tool for us in many ways, but that includes demonstrating to people who make decisions about biodiversity that people care about this species. It really has been critical helping Helen and I get provisions in the development process to ensure that Sloane's will persist in certain areas. And so feel that you're empowered to actually influence what happens for a species like Sloane's froglet, because you are.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dave. Any further from Helen or Karen? No, if not, look, I'd like to wrap it up there. Once again, really appreciate everyone that's speakers, but everyone's contributions, and really people contributing online as well with comments and questions, and there's some really good advice. As I said, I'll wrap it up in this sense that Karen will send out some further documentation, some emails that'll give opportunities to get links to us, the people who you might want to contact, to the app, and some further details on becoming a Sloane's champion. So once again, really appreciate everyone's contribution tonight and look forward to catching up with you. Cheers.